Alright, so let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the lecture by Professor Regina Kreide with the updated title, Crossing Out Borders, Migration to and Within Europe. This event is sponsored by the George and Irina Schaffer Center for the Study of Genocide, Human Rights and Conflict Prevention, and I'm very thankful that the Schaffer Center has decided to fund this event tonight. Before Professor Kreide is going to give a talk and we're going to have a conversation about her lecture, I would like to introduce her briefly to you, and I will actually close the door so that the acoustics are better. Regina Kreide is Professor of Political and Social Theory and the History of Ideas at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany, which is in Western Germany, not too far from Frankfurt. Before moving to Gießen, Regina has held various research and teaching positions at a variety of places, among them the University of Frankfurt, University of Zurich in Switzerland, the New School of Social Research in New York, where she held the prestigious lectureship, Theodor Heuss lectureship for a year in 2009 and 10, as well as also visiting professorships at the Autonomous University in Mexico and the Universidad Antioquia Medellin in Colombia. So she's been to a great number of places to teach and discuss political theory and history of ideas. In addition to her professorship at Gießen, she is also running a so-called collaborative research centers on the Forschungsschwerpunkt. In German, it's a very long, clumsy German word, which you can divide into three words if you say it in English. Collaborative Research Center, Dynamics of Security, in which she leads a research project on Roma minority formation in modern European history. And part of that research on the Roma in Europe is also going to feed into her talk that she's presenting tonight. Regina has published very widely on global justice, human rights, international law, democracy, and migration, and it would take way too long to mention all of her publications at this point, so I'd like to restrict myself to just the few most important and most recent publications, including especially her books. Global Justice in 2018 is actually Global Justice question mark. It's not just Global Justice, but Global Justice question mark. Is there such a thing as global justice? Repressed Democracy, 2016, and Global Politics and Human Rights in 2008. In addition to her books, she edited a great many collections, among them, most recently, the securitization of the Roma in Europe, with Paul Macmillan, the Habermas Handbook, which appeared first in German and has by now also appeared in English with Columbia University Press, which has become a standard reference for scholars working on Habermas and is a very valuable resource for finding out updated material and explanations of crucial topics that Habermas discusses in his work. And also another edited volume, Transformations of Democracy, Crisis, Protest and Legitimation in 2015. She is also editor and founding member of the Journal for Human Rights and has published in many journals such as Citizenship Studies, Philosophy and Social Criticism, Analyse und Kritik, and Constellations. Having worked for a long time at the University of Frankfurt as well as the New School in New York, it should come as no surprise that her approach to thinking about politics and society is informed by the so-called Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which is an approach to thinking about politics and society that aims at offering a diagnosis of our time, that aims at identifying the challenges, the political pathologies, the social problems that actually exist in modernity, in contemporary societies, and that tries to develop a critical theory that is a approach that is not solely based on philosophy, but also based on insights from the social sciences, political science, sociology, and history, so as to try to identify potential solutions to the existing problems, solutions that would be emancipatory and that would lead to social progress. So, to put it in Marxian terms, rather than just offering just another interpretation of the world as we might want to conceive of it, critical social theory and also the work of Regina Kreide actually tries to help changing the world through producing a kind of theory and philosophy that is social scientifically informed and that thereby contributes to solving societal and political problems. I'm sure that it is in this spirit that Professor Kreide will also present to us her talk today on crossing out borders, migration to and within Europe. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kreide.
First of all, thank you very much to Julian for this very kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here and to share some of my diagnoses and ideas on the question of borders, whether they are just or unjust, questions about migration to and within Europe. And I think it's, I would like to encourage you right from the beginning to, raise your hand and ask questions if there's something that you may want to ask about, which you may haven't understand so far. So don't hesitate, right? Otherwise, I hope we will get enough time at the end of my talk for questions and answers. I will partly read it, but also I would like to talk with you, and I hope not to talk too long. We will see. It's a huge topic insofar as in summer 2015, as you all may know, striking pictures and images dominated the media in Germany and in Europe, depicting a massive stream of refugees at the borders and the gates. It was then when Chancellor Angela Merkel took a dramatic decision when to admit about 1 million people into Germany as asylum seekers, bypassing the controversial Dublin account that obviously has failed by then. And in interviews and press statements, Merkel explained her political, in a way, hazardous decision as a sense of commitment to human rights and of responsibility for the victims of a colossal refugee crisis. While this policy gains non-negligible support among the public and politicians in Germany, it is evidently also the subject of fierce opposition and critique, both in Germany and in other member states of the European Union. Political mobilization against the admission of migrants and refugees is manifest, especially where security discourse is at the focus. Depicting the newcomers as short and long-term security threats to public order. And what we have in Germany and also elsewhere is that migration and the movements of refugees are embedded in a broader societal context and not just, on the media. It's a broader societal context in which our world is depicted as unstable, insecure, haunted by threats. Terrorist attacks, we learn, can occur almost everywhere and hit almost everybody. I mean, you live here in Paris and you know what I'm talking about. And democracy is under pressure. Autocratic leaders impose arbitrary political decisions on citizens. Wars nearby and at its periphery shake Europe. And the European welfare state faces multiple challenges. And in the middle of this, migration is presented as a danger to public order, cultural identity, and national labor market policy. And in that picture, open borders and immigrants pouring into Europe are depicted as a major security problem. The threat comes, one could say, incarnated as an immigrant, as a figure of the immigrant. Well, the question, so that's a bit of a sketch of the debate in Germany, but probably as far as I can see, but you know probably better, also in France and surely also in Great Britain and especially also in Eastern European countries. The question that comes up are twofold now, at least twofold. First, does there a right to exclude, a right to close borders exist? Do even legitimate states, those that respect human rights, are morally entitled to unilaterally design and force their own immigration politics? That's the first question. And the second, what, if anything, makes borders legitimate? Can there be legitimate borders at all? Is there something like legitimate borders? Much depends, I think, firstly on what we understand by borders. And I would like to show that borders are more than just barriers that distinguish between inside and outside. Rather, I think it makes sense to speak of border regimes that begin well before the actual passport border crossing and distinguishes externally and internally between citizens and outsiders. So that's the first thing I would like to deal with. And secondly, it's also important to analyze, I think, the historical, social, and political framework conditions of the border regimes in order to arrive at an appropriate assessment of legitimate borders. And for this purpose, the distinction between, at some point, interactionalist and structuralist approaches to injustice, just and unjust borders, will play a role. And also I would like to show that within that frame, colonial history, the imposition of international rules that unilaterally distort power relations, and the undemocratic inability to regulate borders plays a role as well. And finally, I would like to make the argument that this idea that we live in an unsecure world leads, and to make this unsecure world more secure, has in a way a dialectical effect, in the sense that security measures can turn into its opposite and make our society, turn our societies into securitized societies with all kinds of problematic aspects. And we have to discuss this, of course. I mean, it's important to have an open debate about that, and in how far one can make our securities secure. So dealing with terror attacks, but at the same time, do not make it secure in the sense that especially some of the most vulnerable parts of society, the most vulnerable groups of societies, feel more insecure than ever and are in a way also controlled. Let me start by, by the way, just in case, not to bore you too much, I brought also some pictures, and some of those are from Tamana Sam, an artist that also deals with border politics. I would like to start with borders. You know, I go through my lecture in 7 steps. I hope that I won't take too long, don't worry. But I will start with borders. And the first question we should ask, or I was asking myself when dealing with the problem is, so what are borders actually nowadays? Yeah. And there are 65.6 million refugees worldwide, as many as France has inhabitants, if I'm not mistaken. Countries outside the European Union have taken over by the far largest proportion of refugees. In Lebanon, there were 209 refugees per 1,000 inhabitants in 2015, and 90 per 1,000 in Jordan. In terms of the economic power of the countries, this means that there are 469 refugees in Ethiopia per US dollar per GDP per capita, 322 in Pakistan, 216 in Uganda, 94 in Turkey, and less than 20 in Europe, 20 in Germany. I don't know why, but I know the data for it. So you see, the European Union has massively strengthened its external borders, and the border regime has now been moved to the Turkish-Syrian border, far into Libya and Chad. And yet the border is by no means dense, not even when it comes to enter into Europe. Nevertheless, building borders is booming. Also after the fall of the so-called Iron Curtain. 40 walls have been built after 1989. At first glance, the construction of border fortification has something backward-looking about it. You know, what is it about building walls, physical obstacles that are supposed to stop people who have always wandered, in a way, you know, historically speaking? So what is it? But if you have a closer look at what has happened in Europe during the last 15 years, we can say the Spanish enclave CO2 and Melilla in North Africa have been disconnected by a border. In North Greece, at the border to Turkey, there has been built 12.5 kilometers of a wall. At the ports of entry to Russia and the Republic of Belarus, there's a new wall in the southeast of Bulgaria to the border of Turkey. Hungary built provisionally security installations to Serbia, which then have 175 kilometers, and I could go on for a longer time. So what we see is that there are all kinds of new borders being created. And to be a bit more precise here, I'm sorry, that's very tiny, I hope you can read it, but I will explain it nevertheless. There are at least 3 aspects to define borders. To make it a bit more clear, because I think a border is no longer just a wall and a passport control, but it has become to something much more complex. First, nation-state usually claim to have a right to enact means to enforce over its territory. If one wants to immigrate, one needs to get an allowance to enter, and in case one does not have such an allowance, one is threatened with arrest and deportation. So first of all, it's about territory. Second, borders do not just define territory and physical entry to a country. Borders also appear in form of getting access to membership in a political and social community. So political borders claim to determine who becomes a new member in a political community, gets neutralization and citizenship rights. So there's this political membership aspect of border and crossing a border. Third, besides legally defined territorial and political borders, there are all kinds of social and cultural borders. Boundaries would be a better word for that, I guess. Boundaries that deny people to get entry or full access to social and cultural participation in public life. And for example, defines the neighborhood one lives, the education one gets, the job perspectives one has. So there's also this, in a sense, not so much metaphorical side of border, but it's a more think of a boundary that's important. And finally, borders, and I will talk on these aspects in a minute a bit more extensively. Borders allow digital control and monitoring of people's movement and construct security and insecurity areas and populations. So this is all those four aspects here construct something that one could call a border regime. No, it's no longer that. It's no longer this territory aspect anymore. So all four forms are interconnected also. An aspect that's often neglected in philosophy, I think. There might be territorial inclusion, but nevertheless political and cultural exclusion. Measures of territorial exclusion can also create new forms of domestic exclusion politically and culturally. This, for example, is the case with asylum seekers who stay in the country for a certain period of time but are not allowed to work or to vote. And also there is a territorial and political border, but not something like territorial and political inclusion, but still not something like cultural inclusion. This is the case when it comes to the discrimination of groups of people on a certain territory, you know? So borders form structures and practices that define different memberships or exclusion from membership. So a next step would be then to have a closer look at this and find an answer to the question whether states are entitled to claim those fourfold remunerations, that is, legal, political, cultural exclusion and exclusion through control. So let's have a look about the state. And the first argument that one often hears when talking about border control, immigration, and so on. And this is one argument, that the state is comparable with marriage or private clubs. This is an argument made by Kit Wellman. And Kit Wellman says, well, like a single person, the state has a right to decide whom, if at all, he or she gets married. A group of connationals has the right to decide whom, if at all, it wants to invite to join the political community. You know? So one could say, well, of course the state has the right to determine who gets in and gets out, because there's this analogy to a private club. You know, who gets in and gets out. The basic idea here is self-determination, and it seems this embraces the sovereignty of entry to territory as well as over membership in a political community. Nevertheless, I think there are at least two objections here. First, so the objection why this may not be the case, you know, that states can be compared to private clubs. I think that's kind of short-sighted. First, this position does not distinguish between negative legal claims and moral freedoms. What I want to say here is, it's convincing to say that nobody should be allowed to enforce states and associations to include possible applicants. This is a negative right not to be enforced to do something. Of course, the state has this right not to enforce, to accept members against the will of the government. But a different aspect is to claim that a state and an association are morally free to decide whom to accept as a member. This is a privilege. This privilege does not rule out that a practice might be object of critique. You know? One can nevertheless say admission policy is by far not a moral free zone. No, why should it be? Even radical supporters of the freedom of association would admit that nobody is allowed to force the club members to include no members, but surely also nobody would deny that the club members decision is not a moral issue, that the club or any state would be allowed to decide how they like. So here it should become clear that it's very difficult to argue that the exercise of a right to exclude cannot be morally criticized, And I think that's why I think that Kit Wellman's argument needs more than the negative freedom to be enforced legally to open borders. So that's the first part of the argument. Now I come to the second, and since you hear very often about this argument, I make the second argument here as well. By the way, there is I'm not sure that's translated into English, but I will look it up, but there's a very interesting book by Andreas Cassé on also the question of borders, and at least it's in the process of translated into English. And also Cassé deals with this problem with a kind of different argumentation at the end, but I can recommend that book. Secondly, there's a major difference between clubs and states that have important implications for the overall argumentation. And states, and this seems to be very important, states are not voluntary associations. We usually are born into a state and gain citizenship. Or one can determine, one can terminate a club membership. Even there's no other club that will take you. But one cannot terminate one's citizenship and one's citizenship rights easily, as long as there's no other state offers a different one. So that's another important difference, I think. And moreover, private associations are allowed to reject members even if they are born in the clubhouse. It's kind of, but these philosophers, they have all kinds of weird examples. A state, however, is not allowed to reject descendants of full-fledged citizens, especially in the US. I mean, it has not been so easy in Germany for a while, but now also we have this right that you get German citizenship as if you are born on the territory of Germany. So it seems that territorial exclusion and exclusion from the political community has been blurred. It's unclear why the presence of additional people on a territory would make a difference for the political community of members at all. So what I want to say here is, it seems to be that the club analogy is meant to say that there is a right not to include citizens into the political, and that is into the citizenship community, but states are not allowed to deny the admission to citizenship to immigrants who made it to the territory, right? So once there seems to be no good argument to say why one should not stay there. And also Kit Wellman has some, that's my point here, some problems to argue against that, especially because he says, well, in a way, there is the principle of relational equality, which he considers to be important for any liberal state. So once there, it's difficult to deny this right to equality. Okay, I move on now a bit faster. There is another often heard argument against closing borders. Freedom of movement, however, is indeed, the British philosopher David Miller says, a basic freedom. Who is in chains or locked up in a small room cannot live a decent life. But one needs to have in mind that freedom of movement is restricted, even domestically. One is not allowed to go everywhere or enter private property in public institutions to have opening hours. So there's restriction anyway. So freedom of movement can never mean that one can move around wherever one wants to. Also domestically, that's not the case. So Miller says, it would be sufficient when people have at their disposal an adequate number of options related to their generic human interests so that they can make meaningful decisions for their lives. That's what it could mean. We don't need more. There's nothing like a freedom of movement where one can move to any place, any time. That also domestically not an adequate number of options to fulfill generic human interests will do. So one need to think about that. Is that okay? So then we'll say, well, then people may stay where they are, then they have some adequate numbers of options, then they will be fine, One can say stay in Syria might be then if there's no adequate options, but Tunisia, Morocco, adequate options. Well, what might be a problem of that? I think freedom of movement is a very substantial freedom. A restriction of this freedom is a major infringement in individual autonomy, as freedom of movement is a precondition of many other freedoms, which are based on physical presence. This includes the freedom of career choice or love relationship, especially in our global world. It's we sometimes say that modernity has no longer tragic moments. It's part of modernity, no tragic moments. You can discuss, you can have compromises, you find a possibility to deal with that. But if you say that it's not possible to get your meet your partner because there are visa problems, you feel there might be still a kind of tragic moment in modernity, at least. To move places where the economic options seem to be better is also, one can say, a biblical theme. Probably it is as old as mankind. It's an important strategy to decide over oneself. But besides this, freedom of movement has, in my view, a value for itself. We should know, as we who do have a European passport or an American passport, are able to travel to most of the countries in the world without any visa restrictions. If you look at somebody with a, I don't know whether somebody of you is from Pakistan. If you're from Pakistan, you can only move to 3 countries without any visa restrictions. So there's this kind of inequality of what it means to be a citizen of a certain country. It's a worldwide inequality. And it's also kind of a symmetry, so that some states are able, with regard to their power, to decide who gets into the country without any restrictions or visa requirements, and who is not. So I think this is also part of the problem. So freedom of movement would mean that this kind of asymmetries do no longer exist. Fourth, now you see, I'm getting faster and faster. Here, there is another important argument against an international freedom of movement. Citizens have good reasons to preserve their public culture and their just institutions, mostly their welfare institutions. This is a statement you hear really very often. I know also in France and also in Germany, I can tell you, this is the public debate is coined sometimes with a fear of foreign infiltration. The undermining of the established German culture, whatever that may be. But you hear this argument. Now, it's again David Miller, who in philosophy argues that there exists a link between, and I mean David Miller, to be honest, to be fair now here, David Miller does not say something like a fear of foreign infiltration. That's not, he's not in, also not close to this idea. But what he says is that there exists a link between cultural homogeneity and social trust. People need to have trust in their just institutions. And cultural identity is an important source for this trust. In the sense of that you know where your institutions come from. You know that you also will be, in a way, profit from these institutions. That you know that they are of any value and that this is something that you may want to support. The problem, I think, with this view also is, I mean, we can just debate that later on, because I think it's really a very contested matter, especially right now. It's very contested. However, I think that the problem with the view is that it cannot explain why people predicate their support of social institutions from cultural and national homogeneity. Social services and just institutions are a value in itself. As long as people in need profit and the institutions work, support should be there and is seen as legitimate. This justification, and Miller sees the problem as well, is in a way a precondition of the trust argument. The instrumental value of nationality, serving as motivation for trust, depends itself on an intrinsic value, in a way that co-nationals must be convinced that their association, the state, is valuable and worth sustaining over time. So, in my view, I think this argumentation, in a way, is circular. It assumes that people need to believe in cultural homogeneity, and if so, then they can be convinced to support of social institutions. So we will see whether that's convincing objection against the idea that we need to have trust only under the condition of cultural homogeneity. Okay, now comes, I turn to something else, which is another argument, which might be even more contested here. And for me, this argument is really very important, especially because I think we live in times in which democracy is very much under pressure. What I would like to argue for is not more than saying, well, in a way, we need to have more democracy than less. And I would like to do then saying as well, you know, there are those theorists that say, who say, well, you know, if we take democracy really seriously, for example, those who are into Rousseau a lot, they would say, well, if you look at democracy and take it really seriously, we need to take seriously also those newly popped up parties from the right, but partly also from the left, that are promoting the closure of borders. So take them seriously. You know? Then it's a national-wide way of dealing with immigration, saying that we need to close the borders. On the one hand, they cite protection against cultural alienation, here that maybe was from the right-wing parties. On the other hand, they argue against the loss of further jobs and the erosion of the welfare state, that you hear more from the left-wing parties. However, if one takes self-determination seriously, this would also mean, in my view, to rethink what democratic self-determination really means. What does democracy mean? What is the core idea of democracy? I think someone like Arash Abisadeh, but also Hauke Bunkers, the German sociologist, have rightly argued that any coercive submission under rules requires that one should be the author of these rules. The current immigration regulation has been made by a demos that includes only those who are domestically members of a state. This is not sufficient, I think. if we take democracy seriously, this means to include everybody in the list of those with whom we may create and establish the conditions for democratic norms that are not top-down. And so a strong notion of democracy is required that includes everybody affected by enforceable rules. And that would mean that we, especially those, or not especially, but also those outside, on the other side of the borders. In a way, what I'm arguing here for, it might be a bit unrealistic, you may say, and rightly so, but in a way one should at least think about what those on the other side of the borders would argue for. Do they have good reasons to get it? What is their perspective? Their life perspective, their economic perspectives. Do they have maybe good reasons historically why they want to leave their country? Who is responsible for the situation they are in? So these would also be questions that need to be answered to find out about who belongs to the demos. And in a way, I would say if we take this idea of subsuming under enforced rules should only be allowed and is only be required if people are the author of those rules, that would mean all those affected, also those from the other side of the border, should have a say. That connects to that what I call historical injustice. However, I think I don't have that much time. I make that point, and then quickly, and then we have time for debate. Well, one may now object that Europe, or the entire global north, does not have to open its border because we have nothing to do with possible injustice in the global south. Wars, exploitation, corruption are the most frequent causes of migration and must be fought on the ground. What is more, well, a brain drain and departure of political active people would only lead to nothing changing in the immigrants' home countries. So one can say that, well, besides the brain drain, which is a dispute in itself, one could say that the responsibility for the situation in the countries of the global south cannot simply be passed on to the home countries alone. So what you hear is, well, they need to do their homework first. Those countries where people, immigration and asylum seekers come from, the government is corrupt, and it's economically not as efficiently organized. The people just are on their way to find their good luck, and all these kind of problems, they need to do their homework first, right? It's the responsibility of the nation state. We don't have anything to do with that. What do we have to do with Nigeria? Or Afghanistan? Well, it's far away. No, it's nothing to do with us. And however, to get a better idea, and I disagree. I disagree. And I disagree why I think if we look especially, in the shortcut here, especially on what justice and injustice mean, we can see that there's something like injustice that is caused in the structures. And by structures, I mean the international rule system that has contributed to kind of economic inequality, that has historically contributed to the situation countries of the global south are in. And very often justice is put in the frame of interactional justice. So if persons are denied the capacity to know things with certainty and are excluded from knowing things and so on, I think, and I'm not the only one, Catherine Liu, for example, has dealt with that question recently, also very recommendable book on reconciliation and global injustice. With her and also with Iris Marion Young, I think we should deal with structural injustice. Why? Because we need to see that processes designed to settle accounts for international political catastrophes, namely the ad hoc tribunals, the International Criminal Court, operate usually under the assumption of a well-ordered global system with a legitimate authority capable of punishing wrongdoers. And such an approach that sees justice not in the sense of structures, but only interactionally, is not only ineffective in a global system defined by its colonial legacies, but also, and importantly, instead of addressing entrenched status hierarchy, it produces them and obscures the structural conditions of wrongful acts. So I think it's important to see that practices of international criminal law need to recognize the importance of political responsibility for the history of the development of ongoing structures. And for example, the German colonial practices in German Southwest Africa led to a brutal system that did not recognize the status of the local people as peoples. It neglected their right to live a good life, and it also neglected to recognize their particular experience of how those pre-colonial people may experience structural alienation when forced into sovereign state and interstate relationships. So in that way, I think one must look behind actions and modes of behavior and examine the structure of power that conditions what we do. Just to make it a bit more concrete before I finish, a given social structure may be understood as a system of formal and informal rules that are responsible for the power relations between the various social actors who observe them. It qualifies as unjust when the rules systematically place some social group at a disadvantage relative to others, say when it comes to leadership positions or access to goods and opportunities, education, healthcare, the job market, houses, and when those positions, powerful positions, are historically established. Research confirms, to give you some examples, that across the globe, the wealth of the top 1% is staying in the same hands. That is, 80 people on the planet have material means equal to what half the world's population possess, 3.5 billion people. The middle classes in northern countries are shrinking, and the opportunities for social ascent through education are decreasing. And an example for structural injustice, which has something to do with border politics, is that there is a kind of outsourcing of work, not abroad, but directly at our doorstep, or better said, behind the doorstep at home. And we see that among 6 million Filipinos alone work as domestic helpers in private households in Europe, the US, Hong Kong, and Saudi Arabia. And paradoxically, this form of externalization can relieve well-trained women of the burden of household, so that the well-trained European US women can make career. But also, there are other forms of, in a way, one-dimensional border crossing allowances. Workers from the peripheral zones of global capitalism are welcome in the center of capitalism. The Externalization Societies, as Munich sociologist Stefan Lessenich calls it, lives from the fact that we perpetuate structures of domination and inequality worldwide. People of Bangladesh sew our clothes under unworthy conditions. We send our garbage and electronic scrap to Africa. We eat vegan soya products for which forests are cleared on a large scale in Argentina, for which in Germany alone an area of the size of Hessen, this is, you know, one of the not too small parts of Germany, is intensively cultivated with the normal use of pesticides every year. And you know that in Germany we have this diesel scandal. And our diesel vehicles, which are no longer registered, are also legally shipped to Eastern Europe or some of the African countries. So what we have here is that border gets a new notion in a sense, because it's it's only one-sided. So we externalize our garbage and our risks, atomic risks, for example, on the one side, and we leave in some people we necessarily need to fulfill major maintenance work. But on the other side, there is this huge debate about border politics and the closing of borders. So what we have here is that structural injustice manifests itself in the asymmetrical legitimacy to cross borders. It's asymmetrical in a way that crossing borders is possible for something, for somewhere, but it's not in the other direction, or only if their work needs to be done, nobody else wants to do. So it's established one-way street in the world and keep people in insecure legal position so that they only get offers they cannot refuse. So these perspectives, especially structural perspective, is also a continuation of historically evolved injustice, which has started in colonial times. And I think we have, I'm almost at the end here. There's another point, and I can say something about that in 2 minutes. We also need to realize that, like I said at the beginning, borders are no longer just walls where that one can pass with a passport, but it's a fully developed technical industry that allows the management of border regimes that also are not just confined to provide security at the outskirts of Europe or other parts, but it also affects the living inside Europe. And the Roma minorities are a case in point here, insofar as this border control, which has become an industry with science, technology, politics, works also more and more within Europe, even though we don't have borders there anymore. But there's something going on like securitization, where some groups, and especially and Roma people just are one example, but I think it's true also for other immigrations, are irregularized, nomadized, and controlled through technical possibilities, to putting them into camps, controlling them, and so on. In the end, to wrap up, outer borders of Europe and borders even within Europe are coercive in the sense that they do not allow for any other way of living. So they are coercive because they, the right to exclude is interpreted in the sense that one leaves people in just with one option, in a way. Secondly, we have seen that border that the right to exclude cannot sustain. And also, a very important point I want to make here is that borders are also illegitimate, not legitimate, because they determine asymmetrically, without having asked people who are forced to accept them, whether they are allowed to get in or whether they are forced to get out, like the Roma minorities. Whereas Agamben described the refugee as a symptom for a malaise of the modern state system, the refugee as an expression of human beings reduced to their bare lives, the public discourses right now identifies in the bare life a permanent threat to public order. The refugee is no longer the symbol of the excluded, included to their unfortunate position in the camps. Rather, the refugee has become a symbol of the included enemy who is dangerous like a ticking bomb and needs to be excluded radically. And this begins with border politics. However, I think if we look at the securitization and the whole debate about border politics, we need to be aware that it's not only immigrants, Roma minorities, which are not immigrants but have a European passport, that are affected by this. But the question then is, well, who's next in being coined as a threat? And this, I think, is yet an open question and also part of the complex problem of border politics. Thank you for your patience, and now we're looking forward to your questions, comments.
So the floor is open.